Hi everyone. So this week our key term is identity, and we're going to be tracing the history of identity politics through art, through culture, and through social movements. So in some ways this relates back to some of the themes from post-colonial history that we did last class. But these are such big, important ideas that we deal with them in two different sessions. And so let's start with the notion of identity politics and the idea behind it. There are in some ways two phases of the notion of identity. And the first phase, and in some ways these two phases are similar with lots of different social movements. So feminism sort of unfolded in the latter half of the 20th century according to similar lines. So the first phase is that identity, that there's some sort of essential nature to particular identities. So for example, there is something that is essential about blackness, or there is something that is essential about femininity, or being a woman. There's something essential about being gay, or being lesbian, being homosexual. And that in the initial stages of the social struggle, it's about affirming this essential nature. And so an example within the history of art and cultural movements in the early 20th century, you have something like the negritude movement, which was influenced by Harlem Renaissance. So a number of artists, thinkers, philosophers who posited that there is essential black culture that should be privileged, that should be prized, and that should be championed. So that's an initial phase. There's a second phase that comes after this, which treats the notion of identity not as something essential and fixed in nature, but something that is socially constructed. And that's part of what Judith Butler has theorized really famously now. It's a type of performativity, so that identities in political structures, in social structures, these are things that people take on through language, through imagination, and they in some ways perform it. Now, this is not to say that identity is simply a performance, because people can deeply identify with the way in which they perform themselves. So it's not meant to be, I don't think Butler's definition of performativity was so superficial. But nonetheless, Butler and many others in critical race theory point out that things like blackness, like femaleness, like all sorts of different identities within culture and society are in large part and sometimes wholly constructed. They're fabrications within society, within language, and within culture. So there's nothing essential about being black. There's nothing essential about being woman. Those are social constructions. Now the benefit of this, it is an idea that much more recently, we'll talk about this in a moment, it much more recently has come under attack, in the sense that people don't want to think of identity as purely a fiction, oftentimes. But there is a great advantage to this notion of identity, because if it's not essential in nature, if it's not hard baked in the reality of what it is to be a human being, then it's negotiable. Then it's often a stereotype that then can be dismantled, that can be critiqued, that can be sort of exposed as a fiction. And ultimately, this means that it can be changed, it can be updated, and I think you can see how, especially in pejorative conceptions of other human beings or of stereotypes and this sort of thing, that's a great thing, to be able to update discriminatory, forms of discrimination based in supposedly fixed identities, updating them so that people understand that they're not real. And so the notion of identity ran along these two lines. And there's a book called Art and Today. It's published by Faden, which has lots of different chapters but based on specific topics. And in the identity section of the book, the author says that we're still sort of like working with these two phases, and that we find ourselves today in a double bind. And this is the quote, that we're both obsessed with identity, but also haunted by the fear that it doesn't really exist. And so these are two phases that in some ways are diametrically opposed to each other, but they also seem to sort of run in tandem and haunt each other. And I think this is something we'll end up talking about when we get together. But I think what I want to point out, and what I take issue with this supposed double bind, is that often that second phase, the social construction phase, or performativity, especially let's say at the level of race, to say, like a lot of critical race theories do today, to say that race is not a thing, like race is not a biological reality, and this is definitely now true within biology, within science. To say that there is no essential thing as blackness that you can find like in some sort of scientific provability or something like that. To say that race is a social construct, or it's a projection, does not mean that it doesn't have very real effects on people's lives, in society and in politics, and really in everything, right? So I think sometimes the critiques of that second position, the critique of race as a social construct, mistakes the idea of a social construct and performativity as just a pure fiction that's divorced from reality. That's not the way these theorists are speaking about this. So I would say that that this is not a true double bind. Identity, even if it is simply within language or within culture, and it's not like hard baked into the real, into what it means to be a human being, let's say biologically or physically or what have you. That doesn't mean that it doesn't have very real effects, right? So this is an interesting part of the notion of identity that I'm sure we'll end up talking about. So this has become even more complicated now in the past few years. I would say since the presidency since Obama's presidency, and then definitely since Trump. So the past 10 years. And so the notion of identity politics and identity in some ways has been co-opted a number of different ways, right? So one way in which the notion of identity and identity politics has been co-opted is by consumerism and by corporate interests, advertising and so on and so forth. So fixing your wagon to identity politics, not for truly changing the social fabric and structural inequalities and discrimination at the rooted level, but simply as a way of being appealing. And so, oftentimes, this is a form of identity politics, which is superficial, and some would argue like a tokenization of identities, right? So this is something that's definitely happened, or is part of the critical landscape of the past decade or so. Then you have conservative, right-wing people who have taken up the notion of identity and sort of reversed it and said that there's a white identity. And it's now white. It's now the white identity that's being discriminated against in like this new politically correct landscape or this multicultural landscape, and so on and so forth, right? So clearly, that seems to me like clearly a sort of a perversion of identity politics, that it can now be used by even white supremacists or by racists. And then you have even some who are more moderate or on the left, who will now blame identity politics for the rise of neo-fascism and right-wing populism. So someone like Mark Lilla, who's written a book about identity politics and the Trump election specifically, saying that the Democratic Party, being so obsessed with identity, being so obsessed with identity politics, has completely forgotten about class politics and has forgotten about the way in which solidarity is built. So he'll argue that identity politics creates factions and creates in politics like superficial forms of representation, and then like the basic economic existence of people living in the United States, especially poor people, feel forgotten. And this then leaves a vacuum for someone like Trump to sort of sell a right-wing form of populism, which is never really a true populism. So you see how this has become really, really complicated. So it would benefit us to go back and see, well, what is the origin of identity politics, and is the way in which it's been co-opted and taken up recently fair, or has something been lost, right? So this is what we'll do in this next section. What are the origins of identity politics? And once we go through this quick history, which will involve a famous political election, it's going to involve artists. Then we're gonna turn towards the 1990s, which is where we're gonna really be situated today, and the notion of identity. And then we're gonna revolve around a very important exhibition, the 1993 Whitney Biennial, which then it'll open up and we'll be able to take a look at all sorts of different artists that in the early 90s, especially at the level of race, really started for the first time, at least within the art world and the museum world, just swinging the door open for questions of race and identity. So that's sort of the roadmap for today's class. So let's talk about the origins of identity politics. So one place we could start is with Fred Hampton in Chicago and the Black Panther Party and the Rainbow Coalition that he founds with others in the very late 1960s. And so this is an interesting moment because this is towards the end of the civil rights era in many ways. MLK has been assassinated, has been murdered. Malcolm X has been murdered. And this is an incredibly rife time. But Fred Hampton comes along and he makes the argument that, and he says it very kind of really wonderfully in this pretty well-known quote. He says, we got to face the fact that some people say you fight fire best with fire, but we say you put fire out best with water. We say you don't fight racism with racism. We're going to fight racism with solidarity. So the idea for Hampton, I think, is not to split off into factions based on by strict identities, but rather actually forge connections and coalition between various identities for solidarity. And so above all, Fred Hampton was attentive not only to identity, right? He understood that there are different identities in society, but that it's only through solidarity between identities that a class-based struggle, Hampton was a socialist, he was an anti-capitalist, so he was also fighting classism and poverty, along with racism, along with discrimination. And so he was pretty clear that this Rainbow Coalition was a coalition of identities that were coming together in the service of fighting not only racism, but also classism and poverty and other forms of discrimination that stem from capitalism, right? So already here we're starting to see a version of identity politics that's not simply interested in the notion of identity as a separate thing, but also always identity situated within a historical moment and situated within a moment within the history of capitalism and class and poverty. Right, so this is important, and the notion of rainbow coalition will come back numerous times. We're gonna talk about Jesse Jackson in the late '80s in a moment here, but also the Bernie Sanders campaign of the past 4 years or so. He talked about the rainbow coalition, and in similar ways, right? So it's interesting to trace back this term to its much more radical roots within Fred Hampton's ideas and the Black Panther Party. The word, the notion of identity politics itself is usually credited from coming out of the Combahee River Collective, which is a group founded in 1974. And it's a group that comes, again, like the Black Panthers, it comes towards the end of after the firmly established history of the civil rights movement in the 60s. And in the 70s, it starts to critique the civil rights movement, but not only the civil rights movement, also the feminist movements, right? So the Combahee River Collective, they were a group of radical socialist Black lesbians. And they both called out the civil rights movement for its lack of perspective on gay people. Today we would say LGBTQ+. But also it called out the feminist movement for its lack of having a Black perspective, right? And so this collective, they not only are they credited with coining the term identity politics, but in many ways, someone like Kimberly Crenshaw in the late 80s will start to theorize this idea of intersectionality, where all sorts of discrimination and forms of oppression sort of intersect and reinforce each other, and that we have to work on all forms of discrimination in the way they're interlocked, in the ways in which they intersect. This is an idea that the Combahee River Collective already start to expound in the mid 1970s. And so I think you can see that this is a notion of identity politics, of being attentive to identity as situated within a larger struggle, and understanding identity as part of a larger political movement. In this case, again, for the Combahee River Collective, an anti-capitalist socialist movement, right? So the notion of identity politics has quite radical roots here, both in Fred Hampton and also in the Combahee River Collective. And you can read the whole manifesto. It's readily available online. It's a very interesting read. So I want to then move it up to the 90s, because then we get not only to a number of the art examples, and then, like I said, we're going to talk about Whitney 93 as sort of a centerpiece of today's class, but also for us to be aware, and this is interesting because I think it's still an issue that's with us currently, that maybe many of us wrestle with. So the 90s, the late 80s, and definitely into the 90s, the notion of identity politics and the notion of multiculturalism really starts to become visible, obviously not only in art and culture, but also in commodity culture, in commodity visual culture, consumerism, and corporate advertising. And I think, there are lots of examples, but one of the most famous, the ones that are most talked about, is the United Colors of Benetton, which was a clothing company. I think they're still around. Very, very popular in the 80s and 90s. And I think they're one of the first to start creating space in advertising for lots of different identities, and often centered on not only women, but also different peoples that come from different parts of the world. So this multicultural or multiracial form of advertising. And so this is a crucial question for us to ask. Are we going to be killjoys and say that this is just a superficial form of multiculturalism, that they're just trying to sell clothing, and that oftentimes the clothing itself is probably made in some place far away from the United States in labor conditions that are structurally racist and exploitive? Or are we going to say that, well, actually, the way in which race is talked about in society, especially in the United States in the late 20th century and even today, it is through popular culture and it is through advertising. And so it is important to make different types of people visible within advertising, within society. This is an interesting question and one that I think we can wrestle with. So for now, I just want to give this as a backdrop that at the level of popular culture, at the level of advertising, and sort of the multinational corporatism that really just explodes in the 90s, that we're still very much with today, takes up the notion of identity politics in advertising. So this is an interesting question, and I'll be interested to hear what many of you have to think about this question. But what's for sure is that on the ground, outside of the dreamscapes of advertising, when we're talking about real politics on the ground, the sort of multicultural harmony, and in some ways, let's say maybe even like a post-racial paradigm where race is no longer an issue, right? Around the presidency of Barack Obama, the idea of like a post-racial society, that we'd reached a post-racial society, was actually part of the discourse back then. That is really belied. It's sort of questioned by a number of things that happen on the ground in the 1980s and the 1990s. So the first I would bring to your attention is the presidential run of Jesse Jackson in 1988. So he was a front runner for the Democratic Party of that year of 1988, and he was running against Dukakis in the presidential campaign. And this is now well known that in Wisconsin, he was way up in the polls during the primary. And it was thought that he was going to kind of run away with it. But then when the election actually happened, Dukakis won. And so sociologists, people like try to figure out, like, how did this happen? Why were the polls so skewed? And there's now a term for this. It's called the Bradley effect, the so-called Bradley effect, which first happened in California with a mayoral race, a guy named Bradley. And the idea goes that when people are polled and it's between a white candidate and a black candidate, they will say that they'll vote for the black candidate because they don't want to appear to be racist or discriminatory. But then when they actually go to vote anonymously, they then vote for the white candidate, which they may have wanted to vote for all along. And this doesn't mean that, all of Wisconsin was somehow racist. But it does mean that the question of race, the issue of race, skewed this presidential campaign. And Jesse Jackson ultimately did not get did not become the candidate for president that year. And it was a historical run. I think he was the first black candidate to run for a major party, and also took up the mantle of Fred Hampton's Rainbow Coalition. So we're seeing all these connections in history here. And so on the ground, the political realities was that race was definitely a powerful force in society. I think that's an understatement of the year. And so David Hammons made a work that in some ways relates to this. It's a work called How You Like Me Now, which was part of a public arts exhibition that happened in Washington, D.C., the Washington Project for the Arts, in the late 1980s, right around the time of the election. And the show was called The Blues Aesthetic, Black Culture, and Modernism. And so these were all large-scale public works that were strewn throughout Washington, D.C. David Hammons was very particular about this work. It's like a 20-foot tall cutout made of tin, I think, and then painted, of Jesse Jackson, whose skin has been made to appear more white, and his facial hair has been turned blonde. So he's been made to look more normatively white, right? And he was adamant that this was site specific. Like, he wanted this to be displayed right outside the National Portrait Gallery in DC, which it was, right? And so initially the point of the work in many ways was for Jesse Jackson to look out on the National Gallery and say, this is sarcastic. How you like me now? Hammonds is making the point that in the National Portrait Gallery, there are very little, if any, representations of black people in the portrait gallery. And so this is clearly like a sarcastic instigation. Like, you take probably the most important famous black politician of the time, you turn him white, and then you say, okay, now can he come into the National Gallery, right? So there's something very scathingly critical about this work. But it also worked, and I think he understood this, it also worked in the larger context of this primary election. This is Jesse Jackson basically saying to everybody, hey, how you like me now? Will you vote for me now that I look more white, right? So also this larger sort of scathingly sarcastic political critique of the way race has a force and say in the political process. So you're also noticing the way it's installed today that there are sledgehammers. There's a United States flag and sledgehammers that are displayed alongside this. So it's an installation, really. And so this is in reference to what happened to this work when it was displayed in DC. Shortly after its installation in front of the National Portrait Gallery, a group of black men came and destroyed it. They came and just tore it down. And so David Hammonds then sort of put it back together, and then it becomes this work that you can see in galleries. I think it's in a private collection of all places now, if I remember correctly. But this is interesting because for Hammonds, this was clearly sort of a critique of racism. And yet it appears that these men thought of it as itself being racist, right? As itself being offensive. So this is another interesting question that opens up for us. Like, what happens when an artist is working with a really sort of dangerous visual material and is clearly being ironic, is clearly giving us a scathing parody? What happens when that irony or that parody is lost on the general public, right? There's a certain responsibility and a certain difficulty here, which again I think would be interesting to talk about. And so this brings us to the Whitney 93 biennial, which has gone down as in some ways like the exhibition that brought identity politics, that it exploded into the fore of the art world and into culture. It was curated by Elizabeth Sussman, along with other curators, including Thelma Golden, who was the first black curator to be hired by the Whitney. And it was a very important show. And again, it's the show where issues of race, issues of identity and identity politics really explodes and comes to the fore at the highest level of the art world of visibility. And so you had, we don't have time to really look at installation shots and look at the whole, the Whitney exhibition as a whole. It's well documented, so if you're interested, just do some online searching and then take a look at some of these images. We will talk about some of the key artists that were galvanized by this show. But I did want to point out a couple works. So this work is by Pat Ward Williams. It's called What Are You Looking At? And this was exhibited, I don't know if you remember the old Whitney, the Whitney that was on 70 in the 70s on the upper East Side near the Met, for the Breuer building. There was kind of an opening at the bottom that you can kind of look into if you were outside, just like walking by. And this work, this large photo work, which has, I think you can tell, like it's as if the work has been graffitied, right? And with the words, what you looking at, right? it was displayed really prominently. So like even people who didn't go into the show could sort of see it through the window. And that already kind of gives you a taste of what the show was like. There was a way in which it was, it wore race and confrontation right on its sleeve. And it certainly instigated the public. We're going to talk about this in a moment. But it also, if you're like a much more attentive and patient and sensitive viewer, you'll notice that it's actually, at first, what you might think is just pure confrontation is in fact much more subtle than that, right? So there's a really wonderful double meaning to this work, right? What are you looking at? Like, I think the most easy or superficial reading, especially for someone who I don't know, someone who lives on the upper East Side and isn't used to seeing on their everyday. Let's just say they have a certain conception of what it means to be black and live in a supposed black community or black neighborhood, right? They might have certain stereotypes and certain biases and projections that they'll project on someone that looks different from them. And also keep in mind, this is the 80s and the 90s, so we're talking about the high point of the crack epidemic in New York. And incidentally, the Netflix documentary on crack that came out recently is quite good. Which that was a terrible, terrible moment, and really allowed people to reinforce their prejudices on not only poor people but also black people. And so on the surface, it looks like it's these guys sitting on a corner just saying, what are you looking at? Like in this confrontational way, right? As if it's them who's talking. But there's a much more subtle way of reading this, which complicates that first reading. And this is the artist saying genuinely to the audience, what are you looking at? Like, stop and contemplate. And what is it that you're seeing here? Are you seeing your projections? Are you seeing your fears? Or are you seeing more? Are you seeing more deeply that these are human beings? These are young men. Once you start to look at them, they actually have very different ways of looking back at you. So once you become more patient and try to filter out the projections that you might have, then things get much more subtle, right? So it's it looks like a very simple work, but it's actually quite subtle, I would argue. And so the other thing that, and this was probably one of the more controversial parts of the exhibition, was Daniel Martinez's museum tag. So this was a work that he did for this biennial, where instead of the normal Whitney, like I bought a ticket and I put the tag and you just get the Whitney tag, he updated them. He appropriated them with the words, "I can't imagine ever wanting to be white." And depending on when you would visit the exhibition, you would get either the "to be" or the "I can't" or "white" or "ever wanting." And sometimes certain hours the tag would be the whole thing. And this was definitely, for a number of critics, was deemed to be like an incendiary piece. But again, I think this also gets to be a bit more subtle. Like, it's not a straightforward, let's say, I dislike white people or something like this, right? The physical act of taking on a tag, it's as if like you're presenting yourself to others as it's like a badge. It's like something you've chosen to put on. And so there's some way in which here it's as if he's saying, or it's possible that he's saying that whiteness itself is not really rooted in let's say skin color or something like this. But whiteness is a historical category that's associated with colonizing, with imperialism, with supremacy, with power, with dominating other people, right? And that whiteness, then, if you consider whiteness as like this placeholder for that type of historical subjectivity, then going back to the idea of these type of identities being constructs, then Martinez is saying, I can't imagine being someone that dominates, that lusts for power, that wants to colonize, and so on and so forth, right? So it's still quite confrontational, right? But there's that's a much more subtle reading. The other part of the Whitney Biennial, which is really quite well known, and I think this was one of the biggest sticking points for critics, is that there were supposedly non-art objects in the show, or let's say art objects or visual documents that are made by non-artists. And the most celebrated one, the most notorious one that was included in the Whitney Biennial, is George Holliday's secret recording of the beating of Rodney King in 1991. So it was displayed continuously throughout the Whitney Biennial as a work of video art, right? And if there is a visual document in the early 90s, maybe the whole 90s, that would be, I think we would say it's equivalent to all these horrible cell phone videos of black bodies being violently dispossessed and in many cases killed and murdered. So George Floyd being probably the most famous recent example, although the names are sadly there's a whole litany of these episodes. Rodney King was definitely the major flashpoint for race in American society at this time, and so to show it in this work was also putting the socio-political backdrop of race front and center in the show, right? It's quite an incredible curatorial gesture. And so just to give us the backdrop of this exhibition of the Whitney 93 Biennial, we have to keep in mind the beating of Rodney King, the Rodney King trial, and then the subsequent LA riots. And there's a really wonderful film called LA 92, and I think it's on Netflix right now. So if you have Netflix and you're interested, it's a long documentary, but it's very, very good about the LA riots that come out of the Rodney King trial. This gives you a sense of what the Whitney was like, how brave and timely an exhibition it was. Just a year later, in '93, to put race and identity politics front and center in society, in the exhibition. So I'm just going to show you the trailer to pique your interest and to sort of give us a visual document of the early '90s and what was a major flashpoint in the discourse at the time. I do want to warn you that this is it's a difficult film to watch, and even the trailer is quite difficult to watch. It's quite violent and very disturbing. So if you don't want to watch it, just skip forward a couple minutes. But I did want to give you a chance for those who are interested to watch the trailer. So here's the trailer.
We're southbound on Pax. There appears to be 3 male blacks in a vehicle. It's a white Hyundai, I believe.
At any time during this evening, did it go through your mind that this was not a human being that you were beating?
The police approach black men as criminals first and citizens second.
Tonight we must tell our children that for African American children and adults, freedom is not yet a reality in the United States.
If they cannot get a conviction with the Rodney King video available, there can be no justice in America.
We, the jury, find the defendant not guilty.
Today, this jury told the world that what we all saw wasn't a crime.
We have to show Los Angeles that we are resilient.
There's been a mini riot at this location.
People have suffered not only civil rights, but the right to be a human being. How many more Rodney King does it have to be?
the drive.
Oh my God. How much worse does it need to get?
Proclamation of a state of emergency for Los Angeles City.
We have no police support whatsoever.
This is not fair! This is not fair!
That's not right what y'all do! That's not right!
I will use whatever force is necessary to restore order.
Folks, you're on your own down there.
And so you would think with these horrible events that happened just a year before, that the art world and the cultural elite would receive an exhibition dealing with race and identity with open arms, and with basically saying like it's about time, and we have to deal with these issues. The opposite seemed to have happened. So initially this exhibition was widely reviled. Critics accused it of being politically correct. And the idea of political correctness, the history of it is very interesting here because it was wielded by critics coming often from the left or moderate, right? Whereas today, the accusations of political correctness you normally hear coming from the, not always, but from the right, right? So the idea of political correctness within this history of identity politics has morphed as much as identity politics itself has. So critics, thought it was always just politically correct, that it was multicultural, that it was too theoretical, too academic, and too involved with race and theory and critical race theory, and then it was simply, some just basically said, this is not fun, this is grim, right? As if art is simply meant to be something pleasing and entertaining, right? It shouldn't confront you with the horrors of contemporary society. So in the legacy of this exhibition is completely different now. Like, this is now deemed to be a watershed exhibition for issues of identity and race and multiculturalism in the canon of exhibitions. But initially it was reviled, and so I think this tells you something. Like, it's symptomatic of back then in the early 90s a largely white art world that maybe, I don't know if I'm being maybe I'm not being generous enough here, but maybe it's as if like even unconsciously they were reading the tea leaves and they understood that the time of the art world is being de facto run by mainly white artists, older artists. Another contention is that this biennial showed lots of young artists, not only multicultural artists, but that the old art world from the 60s to the 80s, which sort of dominated things, that was coming to an end, which of course isn't to say that we don't have problems of diversity and representation at the highest levels in museums. We still do. But it's as if like the critics understood that like the fact that this is for such a long time was not a visible issue at the highest level, that it was becoming a visible issue at the highest level, like the Whitney. Maybe they understood that we were entering into a new phase, and maybe they weren't so happy about that. But that's all conjecture. So another reason why we center our discussion today on the Whitney Biennial is that it was a flashpoint for a whole generation of artists that are dealing with these issues that really opened the door. Huey Copeland has written a book. He's a great, wonderful art historian. He's at Northwestern. He's written a book. If you're interested in some of these artists like Glenn Lingen, Lorna Simpson, Weems, and even a little later Kara Walker. That's getting a little further down the line. I would definitely recommend reading his work, and his work. I'm actually indebted to his work for this lecture, for what we're going to talk about in a moment. But he makes a point that that in 1992 specifically, and more generally the early 90s, that this is the first time that black artists really become visible again at the highest level, and even start dealing with the legacies of slavery directly in their work. And so this is a prime time for these issues of identity to come through in these specific practices. Many of these artists who in some ways got their start by being included in the Whitney Biennial. So that's another reason why this is such an important biennial. It swung the door open for a number of artists dealing with these issues. So let's end the lecture by simply going through a number of examples. Every one of these can be talked about at much more length. So maybe in your comments, in your writing for this week, choose one of the works and then sort of expound on it, elaborate on it more with your own ideas, because they're all so rich. I'll only have time to make general observations because I do want to show you a few of them. So one artist the first artist we'll talk about is Adrienne Piper, who in fact had been working, beginning in the movement of conceptual art in the 1970s and into the 1980s. She was part of the Whitney Biennial, and there's one of the more famous works from the Biennial I'm going to show you in a second. So Adrienne Piper is one of those really prescient artists who is dealing with race in her work. She's also one of the first artists to incorporate participatory strategies that involve the public and the audience as part of the work. We're going to talk about this next week. And so there are any number of really wonderful works that I could show you from that predate the Whitney Biennial that's sort of representative of her work. But I show you this one, her calling card from 1986. And a crucial thing to know about Adrienne Piper and her work and the way she's presented her work is that she often talks about this idea of passing, of that she's a black woman, but she's light-skinned, and so she says can pass as a white person in white society, and this is a key part of her work and her idea of race. Adrienne Piper is definitely one of those artists that understands and critiques race as a construct, and so when she's out in society, socializing, she might be seen as a white woman, and then she might hear some sort of remark that's in some way racist, and so she would carry around this card, and when she would hear something like this, she would hand this card to the person who said something insensitive or that might have been racist or discriminatory. And it's really interesting in the sense, I find this to be a really rich work. It's sort of non-confrontational, but also really confrontational. So she's not like, sort of yelling at this person like, why are you being racist? She's sort of more surreptitiously giving them this card and sort of informing them of their own position, right? So this is a key part of Piper's work. In many ways, it has less to do with her and her identity or her conception of herself, and has much more to do with the way in which her idea and the conception of her is embedded in the audience, in other people, right? Almost like a reflecting pad of other people's biases or presumptions or maybe even racism, right? So this is a really interesting work. And the work that was in the Whitney Biennial was her work called Cornered, which is a really rich installation work. So you can see you have 3 chairs. As an audience member, people would sit in these 3 chairs. You have a table that's overturned, sort of keeping you, in some ways, ambiguous. I'd be interested to hear how people read the table as part of the installation, like it's been overturned. It's as if the audience has overturned the table in anger or something like that. But it's also like this defensive thing, right? As if she's positioned it in front of the screen where she's talking. It's a recorded video where she's talking as part of the installation. It's as if it's protecting her from the audience. So even just the very physical setup of this installation, there's this kind of tension between the audience and the performer on screen. One that has to do maybe with defensiveness, protectiveness, or maybe, the end result of anger or confrontation. So it's very interesting, just alone the way it's been set up here. And so on the video, she speaks to the audience, and she talks about personal experiences of racism, of passing in white society, of being a black woman, and she's quite confrontational. She said this is like probably one of the more famous quotes from the video that people bring out. She says, "I'm black, now let's deal with the social fact and the fact of my stating it together. Maybe you don't see why we have to deal with it together. Maybe you think this is just my problem and then I should deal with it myself, but it's not my problem, it's our problem." So she's basically throwing out the idea that racism, and these identities are not simply the burden of those identities that have or hold these identities. They're the responsibility of all of society, right? I can't recommend enough, if you've never read James Baldwin or seen a speech by James Baldwin. I'm likely going to attach his famous speech at Cambridge, as a supplement to this video. But James Baldwin makes these incredibly incisive points about racism and discrimination, and argues very eloquently, saying that racism is a terrible thing for the person that's being oppressed and discriminated. But he also goes further and says that racism is also something that eats away at the racist. It's a sickness, it's a disease that also eats away at white society, and at colonialist societies, and anyone who's racist, right? So Baldwin is very, very clear that this is a problem that involves everybody, not only the person who's the discriminated, but also the person who's discriminating, who is the discriminator. And so Piper's work also opens this up, and she really confronts the audience with the idea of being black, with the idea of race as a social construct. And at one point in the video even says, you in the audience, you may very well not know, but it's very likely that in your ancestry you have DNA that reflects a place in the world that is associated with blackness, right? Which can be deemed as controversial. She basically says, like, what do you think about this, right? With the idea that if someone gets incensed by this, let's say a person who identifies as white gets incensed with the idea that they might have some non-white ancestry, that if they get upset by this, that they should really reflect on why they're upset by this, right? That it's exposing something about their identification with their own whiteness, and purity and race and so on and so forth, right? So it's a very confrontational work, and again, one that sort of unpacks the idea of race, as I was talking about, and a lot of critical race studies scholars talk about, that it's a social construct. And aside from the fact that you can do DNA testing to see your lineage in the human species, and aside the fact that we have different some humans have different forms and different levels of melatonin in their skin. Other than that, there is no difference, right? And having different levels of melatonin in the skin doesn't really mean anything about intelligence or about ability or emotion or any sort of natural characteristic, right? So she's opening up this idea of race, which is a very difficult thing to do. And there's one last little component of installation which is important to bring out. On the top of the installation here, there are 2 birth certificates, and they're actually her father's birth certificates. And her father, when he was born, was on his first birth certificate was listed as white. Again, this was like Piper, as a human being. Her father because of the tone, the skin tone. His skin tone he could deem to be white at birth. And the second birth certificate is when the family went back and said, no, this is a mistake, we're black. And then the birth certificate has been updated to a term I'd never heard of, but it's a term that used to be used for light-skinned, fair-skinned African Americans. It's called octoroon. Octoroon. I'd never heard of this term before, but that was the legal term on birth certificates back then. And so again, like these two, it's like the birth certificates are sort of destabilizing the notion of race as either a fixed thing at birth or an identity that's sort of constructed and sort of taken on and more historical, right? So it's a really fascinating, rich, and in many ways difficult installation. So let's go through a number of other works that were either associated with the Whitney Biennial in 1993 or artists that really came of age during this time. One is Carrie Mae Weems, which I showed you a work of hers last week in the post-colonial section. This is one of her most beloved series, the Kitchen Table series from 1990. And if I'm remembering correctly, she was part of the Whitney Biennial. And this is a little different from Piper's work in the sense that it's also sort of critiquing notions of race, but it's doing it by giving the audience a glimpse of domestic life, like a real, you almost get this sense of like a voyeuristic glimpse into this family. It's a whole series of photographs, and they're all very beautiful, very poetic. So take a look at all of them if you're interested. But they're all centered around this kitchen table, and centered around this family, and she's emphasizing the black woman, sort of the matriarch of the black family, through these kitchen table series. And there's always this, and this one I really, there's just rich psychological complexity between the husband and the wife here. You really get the sense that you've just entered the scene and they've either just had a fight or they're just about to fight. Or at the very least, you get the sense that the guy is sort of just reading the news. He's not really thinking much. Whereas you get the sense that she's really burdened by thought, like she's deep in thought. And so this was, for Weems, this was both about creating a visible space for black womanhood, especially black mothers. But it's also an image that just explodes stereotypes about blackness and about the black community. Again, keep the socio-political context in mind. The Rodney King, the race riots, the horrible way in which not only the police and most politicians, but also the media covered the crack epidemic. Right? Think of that terrible show, Cops. Which is so violent. So think of all the ways in which being black was constructed in the media and in politics as something dangerous, crack-infested, criminal, poor, all these things, right? It's just these horrible stereotypes. These are exploded by the rich psychological complexity of this scene and of this series. And so that's a really important thing to keep in mind when looking at these works. This work seems in some ways very staid, very very low key, and also quite beautiful. I mean, as a photographer, she's incredible. But it's also quite quietly explosive of these stereotypes. Another really well known, and they were actually students together at USC. I think it was USC. Lorna Simpson. Who's also a photographer, maybe a little bit more conceptual, often uses photographs of isolated black women and text together. And so this is a very beautiful sort of early work of hers, the Water Bear. You have this black woman who you're seeing her from the back. So Huey Copeland makes a really wonderful a wonderful observation about this work and about Lorna Simpson's work altogether. You only get partial access to the human being here, to black women in Lorna Simpson's work, and you very often do not get to see their faces. And he argues that if you saw, if she did photographs of full portraiture, that there are all these horrible historical memories of anthropological photography, of treating the black body as simply a specimen, and that if you had access to her face, then there's a way in which the audience can become the voyeur, and can project all sorts of things onto this human being, right? And again, these projections are often steeped in stereotype. And Simpson then sort of refuses this by often having the face concealed, or in this case, you're seeing the female figure from the back. And so in a different way, Lorna Simpson is attacking and sort of critiquing, but also quite subtly, the notion of race as this projected thing. Like there's this figure that it's now hard to project. It's a little more difficult, and she's a bit more subversive in not showing herself, or in the artist not showing her. Her pouring the water has also been read as like this quiet subversion, right? She's supposed to be bringing water, and she's slowly pouring it out. And then there's also these allusions to sort of classical statuary and classical contrapposto and this sort of thing that's now being updated by Simpson through the black body. So it's a very rich work. And Huey Copeland also makes this point of Simpson's work. Well, we should also point out that there's a feminist dimension. The quote, while this is a very beautiful and in many ways sort of dignified image, the quote sort of undercuts that by saying, she saw him disappear by the river. It's a very narrative, but we've been plunked into this narrative. It could be like a line out of Toni Morrison's Beloved, a really great, incredible novel. But you just get this quote that's been sort of excised from a text. She saw him disappear by the river. They asked her to tell her what happened, only to discount her memory, right? So there's this discounting of psychology, of ability, of memory, and of someone's position, right, in society. So it's very, very rich work. And Huey Copeland also points out that the structure of the image is very much like a Rücken figure, which is a device pretty classical device here. You're seeing it in Romanticism, Caspar David Friedrich. And then this is the very famous Christina's World. When you have a figure in an image where you're seeing them from the back and they're more or less up close to you, there's this way in which you sort of identify and you get sucked into the body, or the position from which they're seen, right, from their vantage point. And so this is another way, I think it's kind of a beautiful argument, of making people unable to separate. Like it's much harder to separate yourself and project things onto this other person if you're sort of visually forced to empathize, to like enter into their position, which is what Lorna Simpson seems to be tapping into through this history of the Rücken figure. So really quite wonderful work. Another artist, and one that was associated in the Whitney biennial, is Glenn Lingen, whose works in a maybe even more conceptual way than Lorna Simpson. Some of his work can even be mistaken for like minimalist abstract painting in some ways, like Martin, or like Kossuth, or these conceptualists that were working with text. But he's not, he's not like he's using these conceptual categories in the same way, incidentally, that someone like Lorna Simpson is using, the aesthetics of photomontage and appropriation art and conceptual art, but updating it and using it for issues of identity, of race, and the political. And so Glenn is really important here. And again, sorry to keep plugging Huey Copeland's work, but he's just so amazing. His point on Glenn, which I find fascinating, is that he's moving us away from the imaginary realm of culture. By the imaginary, he means like the visual, like you see another human being, and then there are all these associations and prejudices and biases or presumptions that sort of run around. He's moving away from that towards the symbolic, the way in which language itself is encoded with projections and with biases, and maybe even with forms of discrimination and racism, right? So to consider language itself as a function of this larger symbolic system of the ways in which humans relate to each other seems to be something that Lingan is thematizing here. I mean, in this work, which is a text, it's a line taken from a text from Zora Neale Hurston, she was a well-known anthropologist in the early part of the 20th century, associated with the Harlem Renaissance. It's a text that he repeats over and over. I feel most colored when I'm thrown against a sharp white background. And so notice as you keep going down, more and more it starts to get, the way he's printed it, it starts to seep. The letters start to seep out and bleed, so that when you have less of a white background, the words themselves become less legible. So it's as if he's literalizing the quote, right? Where the way in which you can read the text is dependent on this dynamic between black and white. And when you don't have enough whiteness, the blackness then doesn't become legible. So this is a really, really rich work, and also reminds me of someone like Frantz Fanon, who has written Black Skin, White Mask and The Wretched of the Earth, and he's one of the first in the mid-20th century to start laying out, even from a psychoanalytic tradition, laying out how blackness is itself constructed by whiteness. That the very ground of blackness, and by this I don't mean like actual skin color, but I mean the ideology of blackness, the racial ideology of blackness, is foregrounded and conditioned by whiteness. And Lingan, along with Fanon, would say this happens at the level of language, right? So, I mean, what a rich, fascinating work. So many avenues to talk about these issues. And then finally, I'll give you a couple final examples that touch back on the idea of the stereotypical grotesque, which we talked about last week. So this is Rotimi Fani Kayode. He was a Nigerian-born gay man who lived in London, in England. So talk about work that's grounded in multiple identities, right? Nigerian, gay, living in England, and is part of the art world. Part of the art world there. So he's definitely through his photographs, he definitely taps into this stereotypical grotesque. It's often photographs of black men sort of taking on these sort of primitive fantasies, like the naked black body, closer to nature, wild, feral, violent, whatever it might be, more animalistic, right? He's identifying with these tropes. And one would argue, and this might be a new term for you, over-identifying with these tropes. These are often read as over-identifying with the Western primitivist fantasy of other people, especially people that come from Africa. And so the notion of over-identification is like the stereotypical grotesque. You over-identify. You identify with a stereotype to such a degree that you make it absurd, right? That you show how ridiculous it is. It's a type of travesty. A critical travesty, right? So he fits within this mold, and it's very clear how this sort of starts to explode stereotypes and makes the viewer question the way in which race has been constructed historically and contemporaneously. And the artist that maybe is the most associated with the stereotypical grotesque is Kara Walker, and we'll end with Kara Walker, who's something like maybe a generation a little later than the artist from the Whitney biennial. And there was she sort of really explodes as a young artist in I think it's 1994, just explodes on the scene, becomes really, really critically renowned by museums and by some art historians. And you probably know her work. So she's well known for these silhouettes that harken back to a pre-Civil War Southern visual imagery. But it gets updated, like she's using it to show some really horrifying imagery, some very violent imagery, and it's patently racist imagery, right? Which again, for her, this is part of the stereotypical grotesque. This is part of over-identifying with your enemy in order to show how absurd the enemy is, right? Or in order to even have a conversation about it at all, right? So there was a huge controversy, and Walker continues to be quite controversial, even within the art world. There were even petitions against her work by other black artists and by black scholars who said that her work is counterproductive, that it's actually just redoubling stereotypes and redoubling forms of discrimination, and that it's actually regressive, that it's not moving us forward. So this would get us to a discussion about the strategy of the stereotypical grotesque, what its possibilities are, and what its limitations might be. Right? That's quite interesting. But whatever the case might be, it's definitely within this lineage of questioning not only colonialist history and the history of slavery, but also the ways in which race is constructed throughout history and through ways in which human beings interact with each other. And I'll just leave you with this for this lecture. There's this incredible way in which, and this is why I show you an installation shot with a person in it. There's a way in which her works, because they're silhouettes, because they're just these black silhouettes on a white backdrop, which is interesting to point out in the context of Lincoln's work for I suppose obvious reasons. But there's a way in which the work unfolds in the viewer's mind, and even in the space of where you are when you're looking at a Kara Walker, where you start to question yourself, like, is what I'm seeing really there, or am I simply projecting what I'm seeing? Is it just something in my mind? I'm seeing like all this violence, I'm seeing all this abjection. Is it in my mind, or is it there, right? So there's an amazing way in which Kara Walker, I guess a little bit like Adrienne Piper, sort of confronts the viewer with their own presuppositions and the way in which they see the world. In this case, the way in which they see the world according to historical memories and identity and forms of discrimination. And so I will just leave you with a more contemporary work by Kara Walker. It's all. We've mainly been in the 90s and mainly been in the United States for this class. But it's always nice to bring up a more current work, one that was in this city not too long ago, which also was in some ways controversial. This was Kara Walker's massive installation, A Subtlety of the Marvelous Sugar Baby, that was in the Domino Sugar Factory. Before, I think it's now been torn down. I might be mistaken about that. But Williamsburg, and Williamsburg right along the water. So I thought I'd show you a more recent work of Kara Walker's to end the class. And we'll leave it there. So I hope you enjoyed this discussion and the works and ideas that we worked with. See you next time.